Hi students, in this video I'm going to be talking about composition. So what are the main visual elements in your picture and how do they relate to each other? So we'll be talking about how you can arrange the visual elements in the picture plane with regard to how the viewer's eye is going to move across the image, how the organization of those visual elements is going to communicate to the viewer, and using your design principles, things such as balance, direction, harmony, and rhythm. Now, I think our normal inclination to, when we start making a work is to put something straight in the middle. Now, that's fine when you've just got one subject in there, just one visual element like this portrait here. But when you have a few things that you've got to balance out, that's where it gets a little bit trickier. So there's a few different strategies we can use. First one I'll go to is the rule of thirds. Now, I hate rules. Art doesn't have rules. I'm just going to call it a bit of a suggestion. You don't have to adhere really strongly to this, and you'll find that your works will be a little bit rigid if you do try to strictly adhere to this technique. And the technique involves dividing up your picture plane into three sections horizontally, three sections vertically, and that's going to give you this grid. Now, the theory is that viewers will get drawn to those particular lines on the images and these points at which they intersect. So by positioning different elements of your work either on these lines or roughly at these points, the viewer is going to be drawn to those parts. Let's have a look at this image here. This is an aerial shot by Andreas Geffeller, and it looks like the carnage after some kind of like festival or parade or something. So they've got this kind of litter and rubbish everywhere, and then we're drawn to this bench in that top corner with its beautiful cast shadow there. Now, if we chuck one of these rule of thirds graphs over it, we can see that the placement of that bench is roughly at that intersection point, activating that rule of thirds notion that we're going to be drawn to those points. And in this case, it tends to work. We have a look at the entire image. We're interested in the texture and the movement and the liveliness of the rubbish throughout the picture, and then we keep coming back and our eye rests on that bench a little bit. So what if we were to mess with this a bit and try to center the bench? I've done a quick Photoshop job here where I've put the bench in the center, and you can see that you are really anchored on that bench. It dominates the image. Your eye doesn't explore around the image so much. So this is creating an image that is much more about dominance and emphasis than the previous one, which is also about variety and texture. So that's one way that the rule of thirds in this case is working really well. If we go to our next example of the suggestion of thirds, we'll look at this image by Edmund Dulac. It's an illustration of the Hans Christian Andersen story, The Little Mermaid, and you can see that in this image, the pillar is on that rightmost line that divides the image into thirds, and the horizon line is on that topmost line dividing into thirds. What it tends to do is give us this whole region where the mermaid is. It's got the mermaid and the sea together, and this sort of nice separation between her and the man. Now, Dan Dos Santos has done a Photoshop alteration of this where he's shoved the pillar into the center and lowered the horizon line into the center as well. And you can see that the pillar here really dominates, and we don't have that sense of the woman's relationship with the sea, the mermaid belonging in the sea and looking up and having that kind of relationship with the person as we get in the previous image, where we've got this sense of the woman coming from the sea, but looking up at the man on the land with a sense of yearning. So that's a nice example of how when we're balancing these several elements, the rule of thirds is working really well. Now, another thing we can use is leading line, and that's using linear elements in the work to direct the viewers, either through different elements or towards a particular element. In this little thumbnail sketch here, I've got a little package on the front doorstep, and I've used this curling path to draw the viewer in. Monet's using this leading line in this image here, where the perspective lines of the road head down, and we can see some shadows of figures towards the end of the street there. You'll also notice that the vertical tree on the right is roughly at around that rule of thirds line as well. In this image as well, we've got our perspective lines that are leading us down the pier and towards the sunset at the end. And in this image here, we've got this beautiful kind of cast sunshine coming into the room, and it's creating those lovely lines directing us into the corner of that stack of globes. Now, your lines don't have to be straight to be leading lines. You've got this painting here where we've got a lovely curved path that leads us from the foreground and through into the forest. Another technique we can use is using diagonals and triangles to move your eye around. Straight lines tend to make your eye sort of settle on one area, but a diagonal and triangular shapes tend to move your eye around. So with this thumbnail here, we go from left to right, back to left, back to right. And here's a great example by Franz Marc, where you've got this jumping horse in which there's lots of diagonal lines all going from left to right, and in the landscape around the horse the lines are all going from right to left, creating this really lovely sense of contrast and tension. In this work by Egon Schiele, we've got the figure itself at an angle, but also the arms are creating these lovely angles that are activating those extra spaces around the figure. And this is a Kandinsky piece where there are lots of angles, lots of diagonals, making this a really kind of loud, active piece where you are following all these shapes and lines everywhere throughout the work. Now, this next one is about having distinct spatial areas. So you've got like a foreground, a midground and a background, and so the viewer's eye will tend to start in the foreground and explore their way backwards through space, whether it's starting on the figure, moving to an interior space and then back out, or in the image on the right, perhaps starting with the letterbox and traveling along that path past the tree to the house, and then maybe exploring up into the sky as well. This is a quick image here by Susan Baird. It's got a really lovely division between foreground, midground and background. It's also got a really fantastic use of that diagonal line in the middle as well. So you can also use your design elements and principles. So we've probably gone through lots of these ideas about how you might use harmony or balance, rhythm, repetition, pattern. We've got a list that we've probably gone through in class with lots of different strategies that you can use to direct your viewers towards getting a particular kind of feeling out of your work. In this pattern, this is a Marimekko dress. It's really unified, it's really harmonious in that you've got colors that are analogous colors. They work really nicely together, they're soft, and the pattern is just repeated in a regular form across the whole dress. When we look at this next dress by Marimekko, we've got a sense of unity in the main form of the dress, but then we've got these variations with these little pocket shapes that are these bright contrasts. In Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles, like generally it's a really busy artwork with so many marks creating so many directions, but his use of the blue lines, these blue poles across the work, create a really lovely sense of rhythm that help the viewer navigate their way across the work and hold it together in what would otherwise be really noisy and overwhelming without those blue marks. And this is another use of kind of repetition, and it's got a bit of rhythm to it. It's not like a regular pattern where things are arranged in a uniform way. It's got the same shape repeated, but we can see different sizes, different scale of that square, and different orientations as it's twisted around. It gives it a sense of kind of movement. So How do we then liven up your compositions if you're not sure what to do next? Well, Johannes Itten, he was a Swiss artist, a designer and educator who taught at the Bauhaus School in the 20s. And one of his key concepts in making interesting compositions was having a deliberate use of contrasting elements in the work. So this is a list of these contrasting concepts that he would get his students to explore. Things like the difference between long and short, having a lot of something and a little of something else, continuous, intermittent, smooth, and rough. There's so many of these contrasts that you can play around with in different measurements. So whether you have a lot of black and a little white, or 50-50, you can get some really different results. He's also got the 7 color contrasts, and I'll make a separate slideshow about this as well. But this is how you can use color in different ways to create different contrasts in your work. Here are some quick little examples from Itten's book showing how you could play around with these notions of contrast. And this is from one of his students, where you can see that there are some elements in contrast and some are in harmony. We've got these round shapes from the cups, saucers, and the egg, and then these really geometric shapes from the rectangle and the diagonal lines, and of course there's the stark contrast of the black and white as well. This work by Sophie Tauber-Arp has these lovely kind of flowing lines that really kind of lead your eye around the work. And those flowing circular lines are contrasting with those few diagonal straight lines. This work by Douglas Coupland has a lot of things that are working in harmony with each other. So there's a consistency of the use of angles and lines. There's a consistency in the analogous colors, but the saturation creates a real contrast here. So we've got these brighter colors that are coming forward as foreground elements, and then the muted colors are falling back, giving us a sense of depth in this work. Here's a really regular pattern. It's the same object, same shape repeated time after time after time, but the use of different colors is creating a contrast and a sense of variety. So test out these options. You can create lots and lots of thumbnail sketches to try out these rule of thirds, leading lines, how you might create foreground, midground, background, triangles, and then also using these kind of contrasts and these elements of design to create a sense of variety in your work. Give yourself the time to do lots of them, make them quick, and then you can get a little bit of feedback, do a bit of self-evaluation, and see what you can then extend further towards creating finished works.